Let's talk a little bit about creative anxiety.
That's my name. Don't wear it out.
Something that a lot of artists deal with, creative people in general.
And imposters like me. It's part of my anxiety.
One of the things that I find really stressful about making artwork, and maybe you can agree, is that when you're working on something, it either goes one or two ways. You try something and it doesn't quite work and it doesn't quite look the way you want it to, and then you get stressed out because you're not sure if you're going to be able to produce something that's good. Or it can go the other way, where you try something and it looks better than you thought it would, and now you don't know if you can do it a second time.
Right. Your standards have been raised, but you're not sure if you can replicate the process.
It kind of got me thinking about how whenever I would make any sort of digital art, I would have this process. First you do the sketch, then you trace the sketch in pen, then you scan the sketch, then you go over your lines again in a digital medium. Then I would make separate layers for each of the different main colors or like base colors or something like that, and then I'd lock each layer and then start doing the shading for each one individually.
Wow, you had a very methodical process.
It was extremely methodical, but it was, I think, originally set up to sort of mitigate the feelings of anxiety I would get, and then ended up doing the opposite. The process itself was almost holding me back. The process that I'd set up wasn't very efficient. It made it so that whenever I wanted to do something that was a little bit more ambitious, the tedium of going through each of those individual steps as I added more and more detail became unbearable, and that in and of itself would create its own anxiety. I would think about going through each of the individual steps for each separate individual piece of whatever it was I was thinking about working on, and it would stress me the hell out, and I'd be like, oh my god, look at all this
work I have to do.
Yeah, exactly. In order to sort of overcome that, I kind of had to start relying a little bit more on just the skill of working in a single layer, drawing things as you see them, and do all these different things in the canvas the way that you would if you were working with like actual paints and colors and things like that. If you go into a project like this where you sort of accept ahead of time that it's going to be scary and that it's going to be difficult and that you're going to struggle and that it's going to be a struggle. Like if you accept the entire process as a struggle, it doesn't really seem that bad. At least not as bad as when you start to struggle and you think it should be easy, or you start to struggle and you think that the reason that you're struggling is just because you're not good enough.
In other words, if you sort of anticipate and brace yourself for the difficulty, it becomes easier to manage.
Maybe not brace yourself, but at least mentally accept that feeling of anxiety when you're painting something and you don't completely know what you're doing, and some things are working and some things are not. You're just kind of moving through the process anyway.
You kind of just got to live in that discomfort zone.
To me, that's where the art really happens. And so you kind of have to let go of those things that make you comfortable, those feelings of control. Not that I have anything against a really rigid, well-defined process, but sometimes when, especially if you're trying to learn how to do something new and different, something that you haven't really done before, there's really no way to mitigate that experience of not really knowing what you're doing and not really worrying about if you're going to screw something up. That's just how you learn.
And you got to try not to be afraid of failing or making a mistake or screwing up or making something that's kind of shitty, because that happens, but that's how you learn too. And when you try new things, chances are it's not going to be good at first. It might be shitty.
I guess it's okay to say you shouldn't be afraid to fail, but I think maybe it's okay to be afraid.
Oh, absolutely.
And in fact, maybe that fear is just something that you have to accept as the process. Allow yourself to experience those feelings of anxiety and then confront them through the process of making art.
You can't really avoid fear in every situation of your life, in art or anything else. So it definitely helps to develop a resilience and an ability to manage that fear and turn it into something productive.
I wanted to particularly emphasize the part of the video where I'm going over the wood texture on the tree here, because that entire time that I was working on that, and forgive me for being a little dramatic, it felt like being on a knife's edge. The original wood texture that was on this painting was very two-dimensional. It was sort of drawn drawn out with a pen. We kept that sort of flat texture and just painted some colors sort of underneath it without really adding any actual real dimension to that texture. I kind of went into it with some semblance of an idea of kind of what I wanted it to look like, but with no real plan. At first, it felt like a fucking mess. I felt like I was fumbling around in the dark. It didn't make a whole lot of sense. Right there, you're on the left side of the spectrum, where when I first started working on it, nothing seemed like it was working. I was just making it worse, and I didn't really know where it was going to end up. But after working that first section for like a couple of minutes, it started to actually look like something. And then I swung very, very hard to the other side of the spectrum where, oh shit, it's starting to look good. How on earth do I keep this up? Because I'm not 100% sure how I just did that. Why don't you share a little bit about your experience with that?
You were talking about your process. You would do things a certain way each time you made a drawing. I would say about 13, 14 years ago, I had a similar routine. This was before I really had a tablet or any digital apparatus to speak of other than like a scanner. So what I would do usually would be I would draw something in pencil. I would go over it in ink, like a micron pen, and then color it either with Prismacolor markers or colored pencils or some combination thereof. Sometimes if I was really nervous about messing up the line art by inking it or coloring it, I would maybe like scan it and print out a copy of the line art and then try inking it or experimenting with it and do a couple of things like that. But I pretty much always did things the same way with the same process, the same materials, the same steps. Around that time, I want to say like 2005, 2006, I briefly majored in art. And I started taking art classes, and that's a whole anxiety thing because I actually did have anxiety attacks. I've probably said this before, but I would have anxiety attacks and skip class because I had so much anxiety. But I was taking these art classes, and I was extremely bad at them. But they did introduce me to some art materials that I had not previously worked with. Things like charcoal and Conte. We did some collage for some design and composition classes, which I found really enjoyable, and I actually made a couple of collages that were some of my favorite works at the time. But it was something that was sort of an unconventional process for me. I was learning a lot in art history about modern art, Dada, and surrealism, and all of these things that were different from the conventional illustrative art that I had been doing. So it kind of introduced me to different processes and different ways of approaching, well, I'm making a piece of artwork. It may not necessarily be a drawing. It might be a piece of a drawing that I pasted onto some cardboard, added some paint on here, and a photocopy of a note I wrote to my dad when I was like 7 years old. It's a different process and a different way of expressing yourself. I think we even had one art class where we specifically discussed process as being something that's not necessarily straightforward and that's experimental in nature. Sometimes the process itself is part of the art. Like if you look at a lot of modern art, it's not just what you see in front of you, but the process that went into it. So after I had a little nervous breakdown and I quit school for like a year, I actually started doing a lot more experimental art based on what I had learned in college. I started painting with coffee grounds and fruit juice and doing more of that collage-y type organic physical stuff that was way outside of my experience and comfort zone. Well, ultimately, I still kind of tend towards doing basic illustration stuff that's a little more straightforward. That really helped me break out of that whole sketch, line art, color, whatever thing. And that also, I think, helped me get over some of my anxiety about having the line art be perfect and having the coloring be perfect. And because I made a lot of experimental art that really sucked, it helped me get out of my perfectionism a little bit.
There is that sort of experimental nature to art. That's kind of how you learn when you're a kid. You know,
yeah, you're like, well, what if I smush these two colors of finger paint together?
Exactly.
What if I paint on the walls? What if I paint my pink overalls green because I want to be Luigi today? Well, mom comes down and yells at me.
It's allowing you to act in the moment, maybe not go in with a complete plan, maybe just an idea. If you're okay with allowing that idea to change as you progress through the art, I think you'll find yourself a little less anxious and a little more excited whenever something goes wrong. Here's one thing that I think should kind of help if you're concerned with the fact that maybe a piece of artwork isn't quite coming out how you imagined it. It's literally impossible to take exactly what you have in your mind and put it on a piece of paper because you are not physically capable of holding an entire piece of artwork in your head. Every detail, every piece of the picture. I mean, there's just too much. Your brain does not have the resources to hold all of that information in your head at one time. All you can think of is an impression. And that impression is going to be a very abstract thing. So your goal, I guess, is going to be to approximate that abstraction, but it's never going to match up perfectly.
For me, it's not really the opposite, but I perceive it differently, at least with writing. I have this whole universe in my mind, but when I actually sit down to write about it, it feels like I'm describing it inadequately. It feels like I'm taking these low-res snapshots of something that seems very real inside my head. But I think it probably feels realer in my mind because it is abstracted to some extent, but it's abstracted in a way that it feels more real than something I can describe in that many words. And I think the other thing is, too, that art is always going to be a subjective experience. Part of it is what you bring to it, and then the other part of it is what the people who are experiencing it bring from their own lives. It's a little bit impressionistic. If you think about old video games with the pixel art and stuff, some of those can feel really vivid in your memory, like emotionally and visually, and you go back and it's just a couple of dots on the screen, but it's almost like the details that you fill in as you're experiencing it that makes it meaningful. So maybe as an artist, you don't necessarily have to strive for like one-to-one realism because people are going to bring their own realism to it.